2021 has been not a great year for me, to put it mildly, but I at least did play some pretty good games this year, so let's go over my thoughts on all of them. The games I played this year are a combination of new games, games I've been wanting to get to for a long time, and some games I'd already played before that I decided to replay for the first time in years. So, the first one is Ratchet and Clank 2016, the game to tie into the movie that wasn't that well received. This game was given away for free on the PlayStation, so really no harm in getting it, and it's actually a game that I've been wanting to play for a long time. And I really enjoyed this. It's the first Ratchet game in a long time that has really captured the same feel of the original trilogy. I think it's definitely a return to form. A mindset I think will improve your opinion on the game if you're going to play it is, don't think of it as a remake or a reboot. It is essentially a licensed game based on the movie, but since the movie was based on a great series of PS2 games, it's got a very good gameplay foundation to build on, and thus is considerably better than the movie that it draws from. While it does remake a few Ratchet and Clank 1 levels, all of them happen in a very different context, so again, can't really be considered a remake. But in general, the levels are great, the weapons are all really fun to use, and surprisingly well balanced too. There's some decent boss fights. All in all, I'd rank this among the higher end of the series. The two biggest flaws that I personally find with the game though are, one, it being restricted to the story of the movie, which as I said, is generally not considered to be very good. Most of the game's cutscenes are taken directly from the film, but because they also have to fit with the levels, it also cuts a lot of the plot of the film, and as a result, a lot of it feels very disjointed and sometimes incomprehensible. There are elements of the game you won't understand unless you've seen the film, but from what I've heard, there are some elements of the film that you can't understand unless you've played the game. This also means it suffers a bit in the characters department. Ratchet is more of a generic hero. He's forced to fight alongside some incredibly boring movie original characters. Captain Quark is pretty decent, but they basically had to condense his whole arc from the original trilogy into one game, and Dr. Nefarious got shoehorned in as the big bad and turned Ratchet and Clank 1's big bad into an ineffectual wimp. In short, this is something you'll be playing for the gameplay and not the story. And the other major problem I have, and this is actually a big one, is the fact that the characters are constantly talking during the gameplay and always stating the painfully obvious. This is actually something I'll get to again later because I feel like it's become endemic of a lot of Western platformers. A lot of people accuse JRPGs of being too handholdy, but many of these games will have your characters constantly telling the player what they should be doing if you spend like a minute walking around and not making progress. Sometimes you might be wanting to explore and find collectibles, but no, you'll have to contend with the characters yelling at you to go to the train station even though the train station is literally right in front of you. This is like if all of those memes about Navi and Ocarina of Time were actually true. But as you can tell by how much I like the gameplay, this isn't a complete deal breaker. I just wish they'd tone this down. And I'm not sure if Rift Apart does do this. I have seen some gameplay footage and the characters are still very chatty during the gameplay, but I have heard very good things about Rift Apart, like very good things. It got nominated for a lot of game awards this year. I haven't played it yet because I'm waiting until the PS5 gets a price drop and is more accessible. Yeah, that's going to be a really long time. Because it's currently the only PS5 exclusive I'm actually interested in, so I'm going to do the same thing I did with the PS4 and wait until much later in its life cycle to buy it. But I'm sure I will play Rift Apart one day, and I'll probably like it when I do. After playing this game, I got on a bit of a Ratchet and Clank binge, and ordered the PS3 versions of the original trilogy just because I thought the store was closing down. Thankfully, Sony reversed that decision. And replayed my previous favourite in the series, Ratchet and Clank 3, just to see if it still held up today. And the short answer was, it did, mostly. This is a game with a very strong mid to end game, but I did find the beginning is much weaker than I remember it being. The story is unfocused until Dr. Nefarious becomes more prominent. Yeah, it's kind of sad they overuse him in later games, because he's fantastic in Ratchet 3. Some of the levels are a bit awkward, and it doesn't help that many of the early game weapons are really bad. Like the Plasma Whip and the Infector both kind of suck. It's not until you get the rocket launcher and sniper rifle that things start getting way more interesting and fun, and then once you get the disc blade launcher and the rift inducer, oh boy, those weapons are incredibly powerful and maybe a little bit too much, but they're also really fun. And that's also the point where the gameplay starts getting way more fun too. Like, you get some amazing levels, like Metropolis is great, Holostar Studios is great, the boss fight with Courtney Gears is a major highlight, and the last few levels and the final boss fight with Nefarious are also amazing. So, again, it has a weak opening, but the later parts of the game more than make up for it. But because of that inconsistency, now I'm starting to feel like Ratchet and Clank 2 might be my favourite in the PS2 trilogy now. I suppose I'll have to replay that one next and find out. But that wasn't the only Ratchet game I replayed. I also went and replayed Tools of Destruction on PlayStation 3, because I was wondering if that one held up well. That was sort of the first one to really take the series in a more serious direction and drop a lot of the humour. But playing it, this shift in tone doesn't really happen until the last third. I felt like the first half of the game was actually a great evolution on the original trilogy. It had a good mix of telling a more serious story, and at the same time keeping that lighthearted tone and satirical humour of the earlier games. What sums this up is my personal favourite level, the Imperial Fight Festival. It happens relatively early, and it is the game's obligatory arena, but it's also a twisted amusement park / propaganda piece for Emperor Tachyon. And there's actually a pretty good amount of decent dark comedy in this level. And there are some pretty decently fun weapons in this game too, though I feel like many of them are a bit underpowered compared to those from the earlier games. But there are some surprises, like the game's flamethrower actually being genuinely amazing. Once you hit the last third of the game though, a lot of the humour just disappears and they start taking things way more seriously. And this, I feel, is the start of a point where many fans felt the series lost a bit of its charm. Speaking of which, I actually did play yet another, I told you this was a Ratchet and Clank binge, game, Quest for Booty, because I owned this game for years, but I'd never actually played it before. It's essentially a very, very short mini-game that's an extended prequel / tech demo for A Crack in Time. And while it was enjoyable, I definitely noticed that a lot of the things I personally disliked about Crack in Time originated here. The story features a completely pointless dialogue tree mechanic. There are these puzzles that require you to pick up objects with the wrench, which means you can't use it to attack or even equip another weapon, I think, while you're doing them. And while there is a decent amount of humour, they still take things relatively seriously, and it ends with the return of Nefarious, which was the start of him being horribly overused in the series. A lot of people really like Crack in Time. I remember the first time I played it, I actually didn't enjoy it all that much. That's another Ratchet game I might have to replay to see if my thoughts on it have changed. But that'll be the last time I talk about Ratchet and Clank in this video, I promise, because next we move on to Persona 5 Strikers, a game that I will not be talking about much in this video, because I already have an entire My Thoughts On video for it. If you want to hear my full opinion on the game, check that out. But in summary, this is a game that I went into with very low expectations, and I was blown away. With their track record with Persona 4 spin-offs, I was expecting a kinda cheapish cash grab where most of the cast was flanderized. Oh boy was I wrong. Not only did I get a genuinely fun action RPG that was way more Persona than Musou, but I got a story that actually fixed most of the writing problems I had with the original P5. The Phantom Thieves actually have chemistry as a group of friends. Arn, Yusuke, and Haru get actual screen time and relevance. The antagonists are much more fleshed out. There is just the right amount of downtime between major story beats to give you a break without ever killing the pacing. And despite Shoji Meguro not doing the soundtrack, I actually think this game's OST is even better than vanilla P5. Strikers might be my personal game of the year. I enjoyed it that much, and I highly encourage anyone who played P5, even if you didn't enjoy P5 that much, to check out Strikers. It might improve your opinion of these characters. The next game I played was Ghost of Tsushima, another game that I did a My Thoughts On video, so check that out if you want to hear more details. But, well, thinking back, I think it really says something that when I was putting together my thoughts to make this video, I actually forgot that I even played this game this year. I know it sounds unthinkable for me to view such a well-received, quote-unquote AAA game this way, but hear me out. I played this game as a bit of a test. After I disliked Breath of the Wild, I wanted to see if it was just the game itself, or if I just don't like open world games. This game had a lot of things that drew me in, like the Japanese history, the Kurosawa film references, and the combat, and the fact that it's made by the same people who made the Sly Cooper series, one of my childhood favourite video games. So I thought, maybe this will be the game to prove that I can like an open world game. And the results were pretty conclusive. Whenever Ghost of Tsushima was not being an open world game, I loved every second of it. I love the combat, the stealth, the story, the characters, the atmosphere, the main story missions, the side missions, all of that. The problem is there's just a big fat lot of walking and nothing in between all of them. I'm sorry, it's just that Western style open world games bore me to death. I just don't find walking or horse riding between point A and B until you actually get to do things an engaging gameplay loop. And especially not when there's just a bunch of tiny, pointless collectibles on the way. I prefer smaller worlds that are more densely packed, where every inch of the world feels like it was there for a reason. Games like Super Mario Odyssey, the Xenoblades, and Shin Megami Tensei 5, foreshadowing, fall into this category for me. But these games that have worlds that just feel like they're big for the sake of being big, not so much. I really wanted to like this game, but I think it's proved to be the last straw that's shown me that I just don't like open world games, and sadly, I own Spider-Man PS4, and I also got Horizon Zero Dawn for free via PlayStation Network, but I feel like my chances of enjoying either of those games are very slim at this point. I might try them one day, but they're lower on my priority list for that reason. Next on my list is Neo The World Ends With You. This is a game that I was really looking forward to. I remember loving the original game and hoping it had got a sequel for a very long time. And now it finally has, and it sadly seems to have come and went. Apparently the game underperformed, and I don't hear a lot of people outside of hardcore World Ends With You fans talking about it. And among those fans, opinions seem very mixed, with most seeming to think that it's a good game, it just might not measure up to the original. I gave a bit of a mini My Thoughts On for this game in one of my update videos, and I'll reiterate a few of my points there. I feel like the concept is much less novel now than it used to be. Back when the original released, Japanese RPGs set in the modern day featuring teenagers and dealing with teenage issues were not all that common, but now it feels like they take up almost half the JRPG genre, maybe even more. The original was also very much defined by its bizarre control scheme, something that's very hard to replicate and that I've heard that a lot of the ports suffer from lacking. This game does try and replicate it to an extent. It seems like a typical console action RPG at first, until you realize that you can press the button for another party member while a different party member is attacking. So just like the DS version, you are technically controlling multiple characters at once, and you can do some really crazy things with this. Especially later on in the game, once you realize how Neo handles the expansion of your party, though to say more would be giving away major spoilers. Gameplay-wise, I did have a bit of a love-hate relationship with Neo though. There were times when I got very angry at the game, and it was probably my fault for playing it after work while I was very tired, but also because I was trying to shuffle around my pins constantly because I wanted to max out every pin and evolve all of them. I started to enjoy things much more when someone in the comments of my videos suggested that I just pick one pin set that I felt comfortable using and stick with it. I also felt obliged to play on hard for the increased drop rates of better pins, so that was also making things a bit frustrating. But overall, when played with just one pin set that you like, it's actually a pretty fun game and I think it's pretty well designed. The main exceptions being, 1. Scramble slams. I talked about those in that earlier update video, but basically, these are like a Tempest trial in Fire Emblem, or another one of those ongoing events in a gacha game, except it's not a gacha game, it's a full price game. And so, basically, you just have to grind out random battles over and over and over to try and get a good score in order to get the best rewards. It's a pain, and most of the chapters that are Scramble Slams are also very light on story, so there's not much motivation to keep you going either. They're supposed to be breathers after major story beats, but the weird thing is, they actually stop happening about halfway into week 2. There's only 3 in the whole game. And honestly, the game gets much better both story and gameplay-wise once Scramble Slams stop happening. Which is probably a sign they never should have been included in the first place. My other gameplay gripes have to do with 2 very specific bosses. The boss of Week 3, Day 2, has an unavoidable desperation attack at the end of the fights that can and will full health to death you if you can't counter it, and depending on which pins you went into the fight with, you might not be able to counter it at all. It requires a very specific setup that you likely will not know unless you've done the fight before and failed, and even then it's still incredibly difficult, so I feel like this attack maybe should have been toned down. I weirdly prefer this attack when it's used by this boss's super boss variants, where it opens the fight with that attack. Because that way, if you can't counter it, you'll just lose instantly, and you'll know what to do for the next attempt. I also don't like the final boss of the game very much. Visually, it's amazing, and I love the music that plays for it. The song is called World Is Yours, and it is the most world ends with you thing I've ever heard in my life. But the actual gameplay of the fight centers around attacking a large number of targets in a very big arena that you can't really see the barriers of. You're attacked from all directions constantly, and a lot of your attacks will send you flying really high in the air uncontrollably because of how high these appendages are. And because of that, the camera will often be wildly all over the place, sometimes even upside down. It is not a great fight from a gameplay standpoint, I feel, even though I like the presentation. Then there's the story, which is a bit controversial. I can't talk about it much without spoiling anything though. The main points of contention are whether the new characters got enough development, whether other characters were utilized well enough, or whether they just introduced too many antagonists to really fully develop any of them. Again, can't say a lot due to spoilers, but my summary is, I feel like the story doesn't really pick up until halfway through week 2. But once it does, oh boy does it pick up. The end of week 2 is fantastic, especially the week 2 end boss fights. The music that plays there is just phenomenal. The boss fight itself is great, and it really hammers home all of the big story reveals that happen at that point. However, the rest of the game is mostly spent fighting rival teams rather than fighting the actual organizers of the Reapers game, and I just never really found that very interesting or compelling. I honestly feel like you could have cut the Deep River Society and not much about the plot would have changed. And it might have given some of the other characters more time to develop. Speaking of which, Rindo, Fret, and Nagi all of them don't really come into their own, I feel, until halfway through week 2 and especially week 3. But like the main plot, once their development starts to show, it really does, but I don't blame people for finding them a bit one-note until that point. Just off the top of my head, you don't really get much indication that Nagi has any depth to her until maybe mid-week 3. She actually has quite a bit of depth, but again, it takes a while for you to see that. But one thing I will praise about the story is, I think the voice acting is really good in general. There are some characters who start out a little bit bland, but they really pull off some big emotions once the plot calls for it. But the voice actors who return from the original game are also really impressive because most of them were unknowns, and the original game didn't have full voice acting, just a few battle clips for most characters. So these voice actors have to read a full script now, and they do it really well. But overall, this is a bit of an awkward game for me. The fact that I got distracted from it twice, I think by Psychonauts 2, which I'll talk about next, and Metroid Dread, probably says something, but at the same time, I'm glad that I played this game, and I still think it's pretty good. And I do wish it got more appreciation. Its soundtrack especially, which I honestly think is even better than the first games, and should have got a nomination for Best Music at the Game Awards. One more thing I have to praise about this game, and it might seem like a weird thing to be praising, but anyone who's beaten the game should understand what I'm talking about here. The credits are some of the best and most stylish credits I've ever seen. The only credits that come close, in my opinion, out of things that I've witnessed, are Detective Pikachu and Into the Spider-Verse. And those are big budget movies. I'm serious, Neo The World Ends With You's credits are absolutely phenomenal. If you haven't seen them, then you might want to check them out, because they really deserve a lot of praise. But as promised, Psychonauts 2. It's fitting that it released in the same game as Neo The World Ends With You, actually. It's yet another long-awaited sequel to a cult classic. It has a strange development cycle because it started out with a crowdfunding campaign, which didn't quite get them enough money, but eventually Microsoft themselves stepped in and offered to fund the rest of the game, at the cost of Psychonauts now being a first-party exclusive to the Xbox. But they did at least manage to release it on PS4 because that's what they promised during the crowdfunding. I almost said Kickstarter, but I caught myself because it wasn't technically Kickstarter. This, though, leads to the incredibly bizarre situation of booting up a PS4 game and seeing the Xbox Studios logo appear. The PS4 version does have kind of bad load times, but other than that, it runs fine, so I'm okay with that. Though any future Psychonauts games I'll likely be getting on PC since I don't own any Xbox consoles. But anyway, this game is an excellent platformer. I highly recommend it to anyone who wants a charming cartoon-style platformer. It is basically a playable Pixar film. You don't really have to play Psychonauts 1 to appreciate this, but the game's opening does spoil a lot about the plot of the first game, so I would probably recommend it. And Psychonauts 1 is still pretty good. I actually played a bit of it this year and it still holds up. Psychonauts 2, though, trims out a lot of the stuff that didn't really work in the first game, and refines what did. One thing that I love in particular about the gameplay is how all of the psychic powers have a use for both exploration and combat. Some of the combat applications aren't entirely obvious either, so it's great to experiment with everything. Many enemies can be fought in multiple different ways. The hub worlds have a lot more structure to them, and the collectibles are spaced better than they were in the original too. They're also no longer full of pyrokinetic cougars, so backtracking for collectibles is much safer. Speaking of which though, my main gripe with the hub worlds is a lot of them are not able to be completed 100% on your first visit, and the main annoying point there is there's a power that you only get after the point of no return, which means that the first 2 hub worlds can't actually be completed until the post-game, which will drive you insane if you like to see check marks in your completion list. But while it's a fun platformer, the main draw of Psychonauts is its characters and incredibly creative level design, all based on the minds of its characters. And they've really taken advantage of how much increased awareness there is of mental health since the first game came out. But the caveat there is this game's levels are likely to hit a lot harder than the ones in the first game, at least in my opinion. Personally, I feel that the mental issues in Psychonauts 1 were so cartoonishly exaggerated they weren't really relatable to a lot of people. Psychonauts 2's levels, on the other hand, deal with topics like anxiety, alcohol addiction, gambling, panic attacks, PTSD, grief, depression. Yeah, there are some heavy subjects dealt with in this game, and they're all treated very respectfully, and also in a way that still has a lot of lightheartedness and humour to it, where it's appropriate. The writing in this game is absolutely brilliant, both in the mental worlds and possibly even more so in the real world with some of the optional NPC interactions you can have. If you want a perfect example, just search for Psychonauts 2 Pancakes, and you'll find one of the most unanimously loved optional dialogues in the game. Seriously, why is every single member of the Bull family an amazing character? This game also fully introduces us to Raz's family, gives a pretty good amount of development for Raz himself, and also develops Ford Cruller, one of the mentor characters of the first game, much more, though to go into Ford would be major spoilers, but trust me, it's really great. I love what they did with him in this game. In general, they went and took just a few minor points of lore that were teased in Psychonauts 1 and expanded them into the full story of Psychonauts 2. Which actually adds a lot of interesting, unintended retroactive foreshadowing to the first game if you go back to it. Like, the names of all the Psychic Six, you can see them in the camp in the first game. In terms of negatives, I feel like some of the late game levels are a bit too short and linear. The final boss could probably have been a bit longer, and I do think it's a little iffy just how much we're supposed to sympathize with the final boss character, given that it's a little ambiguous exactly how cognizant they were when they committed mass murder in the past, and yeah, to get into more would be spoilers, but I'm a little iffy about some of the sympathy this character gets, I'll just say. But there are some other aspects of the story that are treated as being morally grey actions without really making you feel unsympathetic for any side involved. A big theme of the game, I feel, is that even those celebrated as heroes aren't perfect and have things they've done that they regret, but that having regrets and a desire for change is what separates the real heroes from the villains. The one entirely unsympathetic character in the game is the only one who constantly believes everything they did was justified and doesn't feel any sense of regret at all. Another gripe I have is that, while not quite to the extent of Ratchet 2016, this game does do that thing where the characters will often nag you to do your next mission objective while you're trying to explore and get collectibles. It gets quite annoying because this game has a lot of very funny optional dialogue, and when the characters are nagging you to continue your mission while you're trying to find funny optional dialogue, it gets annoying very quickly, and I wish there was some way to turn that off. But overall, this game was another highlight of my year. I definitely recommend it to anyone who's interested. And I wish it had won at least one of the Game Awards it was nominated for. While I don't agree with it being nominated for Best Game of the Year, I do really think it had a shot at Best Art Direction or even Best Story, and it sadly didn't win either of those. Now, the next game I'm going to talk about is one I actually started playing much earlier in the year, but I didn't finish until much later, so I'm placing it here. That game is Tales of the Abyss. This is a game that I've wanted to play for a very long time, but I finally ordered a copy off of eBay this year. The 3DS version, which actually runs surprisingly well, apparently even better than the PS2 version in some regards. And I'm also really surprised that for a 3DS game, pretty much the entire main story is fully voice acted, and even some of the side quests too. I was originally planning on making a separate My Thoughts On video for this game, and I decided against it because I realized that everything I would have to say on the game would be major story spoilers. This game was a bit of a weird experience because I don't usually play a game just for the story, but I did so here. I did not care one single bit about the gameplay in this one. I mean, it wasn't bad or anything. It's just, having played later Tales games, I didn't really find there to be anything particularly special here. The only unique mechanic it has over those is the FOF system, where certain attacks will leave a residual elemental field, and if you use a different attack inside that field, it will turn into a different elemental variant of said attack. This, I feel, is just much too random and unreliable to be a main part of your strategy for any fight, so I tended to ignore it for most of the game. And as I said, without that, you've basically just got Symphonia or Vesperia. There's really not a whole lot that sets this game apart. So essentially the gameplay was just something that I just sat through, so I could get to the next chapter of a really good novel, because I can say now that Abyss has by far my favourite story out of any of the Tales games I've played. It may even be one of my favourite JRPG storylines, up there with Persona 3, and that's really saying something. It's a story that many might not expect me to like, because it's definitely on the darker and more cynical side of the Tales games, but after playing games like Trails of Cold Steel that routinely pulled their punches with dark stuff, it was pretty refreshing to play a JRPG that didn't. People do die in this game, and it's not even afraid to kill off comic relief NPCs. At the same time, it also feels like nobody dies pointlessly for cheap drama. Everything has a purpose, and this game has by far my favourite big bad of all the Tales games. And maybe even one of my favourite villains in JRPGs now. I can't really say who they are because it's a spoiler technically, you find out a little early into the adventure though. And they have just the right mix of having a backstory that makes it understandable why they're doing what they're doing, a plan that actually does make sense when you think about it. It's just a plan that requires them to do a lot of really, really awful things, and the fact they kind of relish in it makes them also one of the least sympathetic Tales villains I've encountered, but I mean this in a very good way. In short, they're understandable and love to hate at the same time. One thing I love about them is the game manages to make you hate them, while at the same time making their villainy very pragmatic. They never do anything without purpose. My favourite example is a moment where you go to a major research lab to research something for your plans on how to save the world, and you run into the big bad while you're there. They point out that they could very easily kill you all right then and there, but they don't, because starting a fight in the middle of a populated city would draw too much attention to them right now, and you aren't directly interfering with any of their plans at the moment, so there's no practical reason for them to kill you at this point. At the same time, they're confident enough that leaving you alive now isn't going to screw them over later, because once you do interfere with their plans, they'll just kill you then. It's the best way I've ever seen a story handle the villain lets the heroes go trope, without running into the classic trope of, I could destroy you right now, but I won't, for no apparent reason, and the villain throwing away a chance of immediately winning. And it makes it all the more impactful when, a little later in the story, you are directly interfering with their plans, and they do go all out with tragic results. There's so much more I could gush about the game's story, but I really don't want to spoil it. This is something that is best experienced yourself. But I will say that my main criticisms of this game come from a couple of aspects of it, and mainly the early game. So, most Tales of games I found have very, very slow-paced beginnings, mostly because they just throw around a crap ton of magibabble without really explaining it, or when they do explain it, it's incredibly clunky, long lines of exposition. And it takes you 5 to 10 hours before you fully understand what the heck a Valkanus Kriess or a Blastia is. Abyss is even more extreme in that department, because not only is there constant magibabble thrown at you like Phonists, the 7th Phonon, Phone Slot Seals, Darthic Phonic Arts, Hyperresonance, the Planet Storm. Yes, all of these terms are incredibly vital to the story, and you will have to understand them to even have any idea what the heck is going on. But at the same time, there's also a complicated political situation between a kingdom and an empire, neither of which are actually evil or good. A quasi-church that has both reformists and conservatives. And on top of all that, possibly the most annoying, unlikable JRPG protagonist of all time. And this is very much intentional. You are meant to hate Luke in the first 10 hours of the game. And this is where I actually feel that if you are getting into this game, I actually think it's a benefit to go into the game spoiled on the first big plot twist. Because it depends on your tolerance for this kind of thing, but it might be very hard to tolerate Luke without knowing the reveal behind his character. So, Luke is a whiny, obnoxious, immature, selfish rich kid. One of the funniest moments of the early game is when the game justifies the shop tutorial by Luke having to have the concept of paying for things explained to him. Oh, he also has amnesia. He has had amnesia since he was kidnapped by the Empire 7 years ago. He treats everyone around him like garbage and has no consideration for anybody's feelings. He does get much better later. He becomes a fantastic character by the end of the game. But if this start bothers you, and you want to know the spoiler on his character that I think makes it much easier to stomach, then I'll explain it for the next few minutes, but I'll let you skip ahead if you don't. So, Luke doesn't have amnesia. When he was kidnapped 7 years ago, his kidnappers kept the original and cloned him and sent the clone back. Luke can't remember the first 10 years of his life because they never existed. And that means that mentally, he's only 7 years old. Suddenly, everything I just explained to you about him stops being annoying and becomes deeply tragic. Luke acts like a bratty, spoilt child because he literally is a child. Some people may prefer to go in blind, but I personally think going into the game knowing this, and the reason why I did is because Yuri Lowenthal screaming, "Replica!" is a meme, enhanced my experience with the early game a lot, especially when I picked up all of the foreshadowing towards the reveal in how the other characters treated him, because quite a few of them knew all along. The thing about knowing this spoiler though is it does make the first big plot twist a little bit harder to stomach, because there's a moment where Luke does something and the rest of the party instantly disowns him for it. They tear into him verbally and don't want anything to do with him, and he goes into a pretty major bout of depression. Now, I feel like this is supposed to be cathartic because the player is supposed to hate Luke up until that first plot twist, but if you know the real circumstances behind him, the rest of the party's reactions actually feel needlessly harsh, especially since, again, many of them knew all along about Luke's true nature and could have told Luke things that might have prevented him acting so rashly, but they didn't. They instead decided to just call him an idiot constantly. Knowing the spoiler is a double-edged sword. It makes Luke easy to stomach for the first 10 hours, but it also makes the party's reactions to him after the first plot twist harder to stomach. But spoilers end there. My other major gripe with this game's story though is one of the party members, Anis Tatlin. She is, in my personal opinion, the worst party member in any of the Tales games I've played. So, Anis. Her whole thing is basically that she is a preteen girl who is a gold digger, because that's funny, right? She does admittedly have an excuse for this. It's not revealed until way too late in the story though. And even then, it doesn't justify the fact that she is constantly teasing Luke for being immature, even though she is hardly the paragon of maturity herself, and she still does this even after Luke's character developments. And speaking of character development, she doesn't really develop much until, I don't know, maybe 40 hours in. It's just way too late at this point, and I don't even find her that useful in battle either. So yeah, there's a major weak link in this party, but the rest of the party's pretty good, especially Jade Curtis. Jade Curtis is so good. The game is worth playing for him alone. All the hype in the fandom was very much well-deserved. So all in all, a really, really great story. I got incredibly emotional at certain points. I will say that the soundtrack is a little mediocre outside of a couple of songs. Meaning of Birth is one of the late game tracks, and oh boy, the moment that it plays for. Best obligatory Tales of 1v1 ever. But again, I can't talk about why without giving away huge spoilers. Just definitely, if you want a JRPG with a good story, definitely play this game. You will probably not be disappointed. The next game I played this year was Metroid Dread, and well, I've already done a video series on that game that I never really expected to, so if you want to hear my thoughts on that game, then I'll be giving them in those videos. So I don't really have a lot to say here. I'll just say though that this game just, Samus feels so great to control. Like, all of her movements are so fluid and fast, and everything she does just transitions so well into any other aspect of her moveset. The controls are so amazing in this game. I think it deserves major recognition for that. Going back to other Metroid games, Samus feels incredibly sluggish. Other than that, I love the show don't tell in both storytelling and in gameplay. The fact that everything Samus does in cutscenes, she can do in gameplay as well. The boss fights are great, just pretty much everything about the game is great. The only issues I have with it are its short length, but you're meant to replay it. And the fact that it often blocks you out of backtracking after certain milestones. That I wish it would do less of. But other than that, I think it sums up my opinion that I really wish this game had won Best Game at the Game Awards. But yeah, definitely play this game if you like Metroid, or even if you don't, it's fantastic. And now the final game of the year that I've played, or rather am playing, is Shin Megami Tensei 5, and guess what? I'm going to leave you all in suspense, because I plan on doing a full My Thoughts on Shin Megami Tensei 5 after I finish the game. So, I will not be getting any of my opinions out now, I'm going to save all of that for that video. So, I'll see you all then, and it's going to be interesting. I've got a lot of thoughts in this game. Broadly though, really liking it. It actually has some of the best gameplay of any JRPG I've played, so yeah, really, really fun game. Not that fond of the story, but I'll get into my specifics later. I also just started Metroid Samus Returns, but that's also a game that I haven't finished yet, so I don't consider it a game I played in 2021. And also Great Ace Attorney Chronicles, as I'm currently in the middle of, well, at the very start of, that as part of a video series, which is going to be very slow, but just bear with me and my sister for that. We'll record it when we're able to. But I'd rather save my thoughts on that game for those videos, so I'm not going to talk too much about that here. The only thing I'll say is, I am actually appreciating Great Ace Attorney 1 a lot more playing it now. I used to not like 1 very much. I used to think that it was similar to Ace Attorney Investigations, a mediocre first game followed up by a fantastic sequel, but there's actually a lot of really good stuff in Great Ace Attorney 1. And look forward to seeing more of that later on the channel, hopefully. I'll also say that I've replayed a couple of Fire Emblem games midway through this year when I started to really get into doing Iron Mans. Binding Blade and Blazing Sword. I did admittedly promise to do a full video on how my thoughts on Binding Blade have changed. I'm sorry about that. I've been really, really busy with a lot of different things, both in life and in the channel. I really shouldn't overtly promise stuff like that, I just realized. So, I don't know if I'll ever do that video, but as a brief summary, I actually think the map design and overall gameplay of FE6 are actually excellent. Way better than I remember them, and it is nowhere near my least favorite Fire Emblem game anymore for its gameplay alone. Also, it is surprisingly balanced. I know that a lot of the meme units like Gwendolyn and Sophia are so bad that a lot of people get the impression that it's a badly balanced game, but really, they're just the outliers. Most characters are at least usable, the Jagan is not broken, and the only characters I would classify as maybe being a bit too good are Milady and Percival, but they come mid-game rather than early game, so there's at least that. And honestly, I feel like Milady is only broken because of how easy the Delphi shield is to steal. The thing I've come to like most about Binding Blade is that enemies are actually a threat. They go for quality over quantity, and maps don't really have a whole lot of choke points, and they have just the perfect placement of terrain to have a nice flow to them. You really have to treat every character in your army like a tool for a specific job. Unlike some games like Path of Radiance and non-maddening Three Houses, where every character in your army eventually just devolves into point this thing at the enemy and they die. If you use the wrong person for the wrong enemy, they will die. But if you use the right person, the enemy will crumple very quickly. Javelins and hand axes aren't broken because 1 to 2 range enemies are somewhat rare, and shock horror, I actually don't mind the janky hit rates in Binding Blade, because it actually makes swords good for something. The fact that lance and axes have bad hit rates means that the reliable accuracy of swords is a very valuable niche. If you got an enemy on very low HP that absolutely needs to die, or someone else in your army is going to get slaughtered, you need to use a sword for that. You cannot afford to use a lance or axe. And yeah, again, it gives them a niche they don't have in other games where everything is accurate. I don't mind that all the maps are Cs now, because I've started to realize that objective variety doesn't really matter all that much when most Fire Emblem objectives actually aren't very good. Route is tedious, defeat boss is way too easy to cheese, and defend maps generally revolve into just boring turtling. So everything being Cs, again, not that bad when Cs is one of the few good objectives in Fire Emblem. And to that note, I don't mind the fact that Roy is bad, because it makes the maps more about a puzzle on how to get him to the end. I like to think of Roy as less of a combat unit and more of a football that you have to escort into the enemy's goal zone. However, I really don't like how much evasion thrones give. The way I sum it up, I really should not be having sub 50 hit rates against general bosses with weapon triangle disadvantage. And Swordmasters with Armor Slayers should not be better counters to general bosses than axe users or mages. The story I also no longer hate, but I don't think it's the greatest either. I just find it okay and broadly inoffensive. But I still can't really find myself getting attached to Binding Blade's characters, and it's not because I think they're bad characters. Looking at some of the supports online, there's actually a lot of really good ones there. The problem, I feel, is how painfully slow supports are to rank up in Binding Blade. The vast majority of supports have a rate of 0+0. This means the characters involved need 200 turns of being adjacent to get an A rank, and that is just downright stupid, especially in a game that encourages you to move quickly and not turtle. Going for supports practically requires you to mash end turn 50 times at the end of a map, and it's just kind of a pain. In most other Fire Emblem games, simply using a character would guarantee you get at least a few C's and B's with them, but that's not the case in this game, and again, I think that's probably why a lot of people don't like Binding Blade's cast. The game just doesn't give you a lot of good chances to get to know them. I think it's part of why Roy and Lilina is one of the most accepted canon pairings in Fire Emblem, because it's one of Binding Blade's only fast supports, so one of the very few that casual players are likely to see. Oh, and did I mention this game has a limit of 120 support points gained per chapter? And that's across your entire army, by the way, so if you have 12 people deployed and each of them gain 10 support points, that's your support cap for the chapter. The last thing I'll say about Binding Blade, though, is there's one aspect of it that I still hate, and that's the soundtrack. I don't know if this is a common opinion, but I think that Fire Emblem 6's soundtrack sounds like absolute garbage. Like, it's just awful. It's not only my least favorite soundtrack in the series, it's one of my least favorite soundtracks in all of video games. And I don't think the songs themselves are inherently bad. A lot of their remixes in Smash Bros are fantastic, and this is why I'd love to see a remake of FE6, because the songs could be good if they were given proper instrumentation. It's just, the sound font they used is just I hate to say this, but it's almost all farty trumpets. It just sounds so bad. Yeah, the battle preparations theme in particular is like, it's just farts, basically. I will say one of the few songs I actually like is the one that plays during the Western Isles arc. That one actually makes decent use of the sound font they had. But everything else though, yeah, it actually almost makes me sick how much I hate Binding Blade's soundtrack. I know that's not a common opinion, but it is mine. So, I also played Blazing Sword, and I gave some thoughts on that in another update video I did, but in short, I am starting to see a lot more flaws with that game than I used to. Not so much in terms of how much people hate the story now, because I was skipping most of the cutscenes, but more just the fact that Blazing Sword loves to swarm you with weak cannon fodder. It's kind of the opposite of Binding Blade, and I think it's because of that characters like Marcus are broken, because the stat benchmarks for being good in Blazing Sword are really, really low. It also makes javelins and hand axes broken because most enemies get doubled by them. Also, I used to constantly swear by Lyn and get really mad when people said she was a bad unit. Actually playing the game again after like about a decade, I understand exactly what people are saying. Yeah, Lyn is pretty bad and there's no sugarcoating it. And this was with me playing Lyn mode, by the way. I gave her a lot of favoritism there and she was still pretty bad. This was on Hector Hard mode admittedly, but honestly, I don't actually find Hector Hard mode all that difficult, because of how low the enemy stats are. The fact that my first ever Iron Man of FE7 made it all the way up to the Armads chapter, which is like, what, like 28 or 27 or something? I think that's decently impressive. But the funny thing is that I watched a video talking about Iron Mans after my own Iron Man ended, and they said that FE7 is actually a very bad Iron Man game, and I definitely agree. There's just way too many ways to get a game over in FE7, and there's the fact that you have 3 lords, and you're faced with a sadistic choice there. You either train Lyn and Eliwood in an Iron Man, or you don't train them, and then in the chapters where they're forced deployments, you have to dedicate a huge amount of resources to babysitting both of them. It's a pain no matter which way you go for. And that should cover it for my thoughts on games I played in 2021. There were actually quite a lot of games, and I still haven't even gone through my whole backlog. Next year I might play 13 Sentinels and Astral Chain. I've heard very good things about both of those, and I'm looking forward to playing the Advance Wars reboot, and yeah, maybe some other games as well. So, I'll see you next time, and I hope that, there are a lot of fun games to play in 2022.